All right, afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us, both here in person in Pittsburgh and for the folks online. Just to introduce myself, my name is Steve Wall. I'm the president of Synoptic Data Public Benefit Corporation. The honest truth is, I had not heard of ESIP until about 6 months ago. And then we're sitting around at a company meeting. We said, well, we are earth science information professionals, so we probably ought to check this organization out. We reached out, become a member, and even proposed this session for this afternoon, because public-private partnerships are something that is in our lifeblood, and I know there's more and more of that coming on. So really excited to be here. We thank the ESIP community for the welcome we've gotten, and we're really happy to be here. Just want to also give a thanks to, I'm stepping in for my colleague Elizabeth Wilson, who has done the lion's share of the work to prep for this session. I'm not sure whether Elizabeth is able to dial in now, but my thanks to her. She did a lot of great prep work for our identifying the panels, our speakers, and putting together the questions and kind of the content of what we're going to go through. And so what we kind of have in mind is we have 5 speakers. I was actually one of the speakers, so we're going to have 4.5 speakers. I'm going to take a half session, and then that'll be relatively brief. And then what we want to do is about a 20-minute panel discussion where we'll throw out a couple questions to our panelists, both here in Pittsburgh and online, and certainly open it up to the audience, both in person and virtual, if you want to throw in on those conversations. And then we do have time set aside for a breakout groups. Can you tell how many folks are online? Right now we have 8. Okay. So we'll see whether we can get an online group together. If not, we'll put them on hold and we'll do something here. And then we'll do a debrief at the end and wrap things up. So I guess without any further ado, let me make sure, do I see, is Curtis on? You see, Curtis, if you're on, can you unmute and speak? All right. All right. My colleague Ashish in the back, can you text Elizabeth and have her reach out to Curtis and make sure he gets the login instructions as well? Do a little bit of audible then. So I'm going to shift the order a little bit, and we will go to another speaker to my left here, Jeff Rex. Currently serves as Vice President of Business Development for Earth Intelligence for Spire Global. He joined Spire in 2020, headed up their weather efforts before taking this current position. His focus is on space-based, atmospheric, and other data from Spire's satellites. And prior to that, he's worked in the aviation industry, including VP of Sales, Marketing, Business Development for Flight Aerospace, similar positions for Panasonic and AirDat before that. And responsibilities of the development, certification, operation of innovative aircraft-based weather data systems, as well as the design, development, and installation of weather, flight tracking, and satellite communication solutions. And so a real strong background from Jeff. We've worked with him for several years as a partner and both customers in both directions. A real solid background in aviation and now in the satellite side. Has a bachelor's in aerospace engineering and master's in engineering management, both from the University of Colorado, as well as graduate certificates along the way. So, Jeff, let me turn it over to you. And this is Jeff Rex.
Thanks very much, Steve.
You run your own slides, or shall I?
Yeah, I can advance them, whatever you want to do.
Let's just find.
That's the one.
And let's make sure we're sharing our screen. You should be.
And there it goes. Excellent. As Steve said, my name's Jeff. Thank you all for having me here. Thanks, Steve, for the invitation as well. And thanks to Elizabeth, if she's online as well, for coordinating all of this. It's great. Happy to be here and talk today a bit about public-private partnerships and how Spire works with different agencies, not only in the US, but we'll touch a little bit on some international relationships as well. But before we do that, just to set the stage, because I'm sure there are a fair amount of people who haven't heard of Spire or wonder what our tie-in is or what we do, I'll just give a little background of the company. We've been around about 10 years. We launched our first satellite probably 3 or 4 years after that. We've been working to improve on and expand the technology within our satellites over that time, to the extent where we now have well over 100 satellites in space. They're nano satellites, so they're about this big, about the size of a wine box, which is really cool because it does a couple of things. It allows us to produce them in kind of in a more rapid way and deploy them and launch them in a more rapid way. It also allows us to do more software, remote refreshes via software-defined radios that are on board. And then the life cycle of the satellites themselves tends to be just around 3 or 4 years. So if there's a hardware refresh needed, we can do that as well on a pretty quick cycle. So it's a little different than the traditional satellite industry of having a $100 million satellite go up that's there for 20 years and you just let it do whatever you send it up to do. So we're doing things a little differently. Really what we look at as a company is looking at things globally. So we're trying to gather as much information from space to gather problems here on Earth. So using space as the ultimate vantage point for gathering data and fixing and solving global problems. Because we kind of are, under the motto that when you're looking at things from space, you don't see borders. The weather data doesn't care about the borders. The soil moisture data doesn't care about the borders, and the patterns don't. So we kind of look at it as a global effort. We've launched over 30 launch campaigns with 10 different providers, although for those of you who've seen recent press releases, we have had kind of a streak of using a little more SpaceX lately, which seems to be a common thing with a lot of companies, I think. And we've got a pretty big customer base across 60 countries. We went public just last year on the New York Stock Exchange. So that's kind of where our financial backing comes from. The company's really divided into 5 different areas of focus. And we'll end up on Earth Intelligence last because that's kind of the most pertinent to this discussion. But I'll start with Maritime, which is our largest business unit. One of the things we do with our satellites is we track ships. In addition to tracking ships, we're also able to track weather patterns. But AIS is the standard for tracking ships through the International Maritime Organization. So we provide our customers not only with tracking information, but route optimization information to minimize carbon emissions, sulfuric emissions, and minimize fuel burn and maximize the efficiency of their operations. At the other end, there's aviation, which similarly, we track aircraft using space-based automated dependent surveillance. The ADS-B technology is analogous to AIS, but it's used for aircraft. Aviation business is probably our newest business, so that's still growing. We also have a weather business, which takes advantage of all of our Earth Intelligence data and all the other data that we can pull in from different sources around the globe. And we assimilate the data, we quality check it, we run our own numerical weather prediction models, and then provide tailored forecasts to our customers. And I'll skip the Earth Intelligence and come back to that in a minute. And we have a space services business. This is probably our fastest growing business right now. And that's, if you'd have asked me that 2 years ago, that probably wouldn't have been the case. We'd have said, oh, that's the new young one that we're just working on. But what's happened is we've, over the last 10 years, developed such a heritage from concept, design, development, manufacturing, through to launch and operations of how to put things in space and get data from space, that we kind of realized, hey, we've done this a lot, and a lot of people want data from space. But a lot of people also don't want to mess with developing satellites, operating satellites, and doing that. So we provide a multi-tiered service of space services, which is if you have a product or a software that, or a technology that you want to deploy in space and gather data for your business, we enable that to happen, and we basically take care of all the space work and provide your company or organization an API. So you just get the data. And then on Earth Intelligence, that's basically us gathering our atmospheric data. So jumping into a little more detail on Earth Intelligence, the one that we're probably the most known for is radio occultation data. Radio occultation data is basically our satellite's catching a GNSS signal as it goes through the atmosphere, it refracts based on the density of the atmosphere. So as that signal goes through the atmosphere, it refracts a certain amount. The satellite compares that refracted signal to an unrefracted signal, basically a pure GNSS signal, and uses the difference to calculate weather parameters. So it's kind of like having a weather balloon profile through the atmosphere, but instead of doing it from the ground up, you're doing it from space down. Another product we create or we gather with our satellites is reflectometry-based products. So there are multiple aspects to that, but the two most common ones are soil moisture, which is where the green lines in the diagram, where instead of the data going through the atmosphere, it's bouncing off of the earth and reflecting back. So we can use that to measure subsurface moisture, surface soil moisture, and sea ice. Additionally, with sea ice, we can measure the age and the altimetry properties through a technique called grazing angle. So grazing angle is more of a flatter plane angle, but it's still a reflectometry, and it allows us to basically catch that signal and see what the altimetry is of sea ice in the poles. To the other end, above the atmosphere, we also gather ionospheric data, total electron content, and scintillation, and precise orbit determination, which is our way of making sure that everything we gather is as precise as it can be. We try to know where our satellites are within a 10-centimeter error or so. So that maximizes the accuracy of the radio occultation reflectometry signals, also the ionospheric information. So look, what's a little bit different about us is you'll notice I said GNSS, radio occultation, and reflectometry. That's because we leverage the use of multiple GNSS systems, not just GPS. So in addition to GPS, we are able to catch signals from Galileo, QZSS, GLONASS, and Beidou, which is the Chinese equivalent as well. And different customers, going to the public-private partnership thing, different customers want different things. And someone will say, well, I want data that originates from this constellation or that constellation, and we're able to work that out. Right now, we do about 15,000 profiles a day. Sometimes that number gets a little higher than that, but we're always above that number, and we generally deliver the data in 90 minutes or less. So some of the public-private partnerships, primary one that I think a lot of people are familiar with is the one with NOAA under the Commercial Data Program. So this started with the Commercial Weather Data Pilot in 2016 and evolved from there. We're currently on Delivery Order 4, which is where we're delivering 5,500 profiles a day minimum to NOAA. They ingest those in real time into their global model, and they're used in every forecast you receive that you get from NOAA or you see on the news or anything like that. One thing that happened to just since I sent these slides, which is kind of interesting, is there's another public-private partnership that was just signed the last couple days. It's also under the Commercial Data Program, but it's a commercial space weather data pilot. And so it's ionospheric data looking at space weather and data in the ionosphere to try and see where there might be interference with satellite communications, navigation, things like that. And then the other large US example we have is working with NASA on the Commercial Smallsat Data Acquisition Program. This program is based on historical data, not really old historical data, but 30 days or greater. And instead of just radio occultation data, it's kind of the full suite of data I showed on the prior slide. And then jumping across the pond, or ponds, I guess, in this case, there are a couple of other public-private partnership type relationships we have, kind of correlating to the NASA partnership. We have a partnership with ESA called Earth Online, and that is basically something that allows research institutes and other government organizations, anyone looking to do research and look at historical information, to buy data through Earth Online, buy our data through Earth Online. And then with EUMETSAT, that kind of is a corollary to the NOAA relationship, where we sell radio occultation data into EUMETSAT, which ends up with their constituents, ECMWF, Matteo France, the Met Office, all of their constituents use it to run their global models. We also have a small data lake, which is another government relationship with the Luxembourg Space Agency. That's predominantly used in country So most things do funnel through that ESA relationship in Europe. And then we also have a partnership through one of our partner companies called Itochu in Japan, and they help us work through different government entities in Japan and throughout the Pacific Rim and Asia.
All right, great, Jeff, thanks. I guess any quick questions from the room, or will they come up in chat? Excuse me.
Come up and chat.
For Jeff? Yeah, sure, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, hang on.
Hi, Dave Jones with Storm Center Communications.
Yeah.
Are most of your customers buying your data to put into numerical prediction models or any other type of modeling?
Yes. So they kind of split it into two different categories. The UMETSAT and the NOAA relationships are those that are buying real-time data, and it has to be very quick to be useful, of course, because weather data is very perishable. So that data is real-time. It goes directly into their numerical weather prediction models at ECMWF, for instance, and at NOAA. So getting a little bit technical in the weeds on NOAA, NESDIS buys the data, provides it into the NOAA organization, and the National Weather Service produces the output, uses it in their output.
It's all right. I've been sitting all day. I need the exercise.
One follow-up question to that is, I suspect that NOAA has done like studies on the benefits of the data to the numerical weather prediction impacts. You know, like how accurate is it without the data? How accurate is it with the data?
Yeah, so yes, NOAA has, the Air Force has, the Met Office has, and ECMWF has. And I'm probably missing a couple. But there's I could get with you afterwards and show you a diagram. I didn't include it here just because of the length, but there's an impact study done both by the Met Office and ECMWF about 3 years ago. And both of those show significant impact of RO on model skill, basically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? All right.
Oh, we do have one.
Oops.
Oh, did we start early? This says they thought we started at 4:30.
Yeah. Hey, Curtis. Yeah, no, you're good.
Curtis, I covered for you.
Yeah. So I think, Curtis, if you're ready to go, we will throw you into the pit. Next up is Dr. Curtis Marshall. He is a meteorologist with the National Weather Service Office of Observations in Silver Spring at the headquarters. He's responsible for program management, scientific oversight of two public-private partnerships programs. Number one is the National Mesonet Program. Number two is the Aircraft-Based Observation Program. Related to that second one, he's also the chair of the WMO's expert team on aircraft-based observations. Prior to that, he was a scientist at the National Academy of Sciences, and as part of that, he was part of the team that put together the report from the ground up, a nationwide network of networks, which served as sort of the intellectual foundation for the National Mesonet Program. So also prior to that was at NCEP as an environment at the EMC, BS and MS from Oklahoma, and a PhD in atmospheric science from Colorado State. So Dr. Curtis Marshall, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, and I apologize. I had 4:30 as the start time, and it took me a while to find the correct Zoom. There's many Zooms, and then I saw Jeff was talking, and I'm like, oops, I'm late. So let me see if I can share my screen here, and I'll try to drive this presentation from my end. So
You should be a co-host, and we should be set up for that.
all right, thank you. Okay, is it working in display mode now?
We'll give the internet a minute to decide which pipe to go through. I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah. So we've got the slides, Curtis. We can do it if you just walk us through it.
Well, I shared my screen here. So yeah, if you want to bring them up, that works just as well for me too. So whatever.
Is he 2, 3?
He is 1.
1. I will walk through those for you, so just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
All right, thank you.
And I will share my screen, and I will do it the right way this time. My apologies. You should be set.
Yes, thank you very much. So, yes, as Steve mentioned, I manage the National Weather Service's National Mesonet Program and also the Aircraft-Based Observations Program. Those are sort of two similar but different approaches to public-private partnerships for commercial weather data. You can go to the next slide, please. The National Mesonet Program began in 2009, as Steve mentioned, from the report from the National Academies, spurred Congress to establish that as a public-private partnership in the Weather Service's budget. Historically, the term Mesonet refers to surface meteorological data, although in recent years, these networks have grown well beyond that to encompass different types of what we call mesoscale observations, fine scale observations that are sort of filling in gaps in federal networks, and also vertical profiles, systems on the ground that give you wind temperature and moisture, not just at the surface, but at multiple heights in the vertical as you go up, sort of like what a weather balloon does when you launch it, take a sample every few seconds and get a vertical profile. So the Mesonet program is now about almost 50 networks, mostly from the states, about 8 private sector networks with good nationwide coverage. And we purchase those data from the states and the private sector, and we use it in all facets of NWS operations. Next slide, please. I don't have an explicit slide here for the Aircraft-Based Observations Program. It's similar to a component of Mesonet that's called TAMDAR. These are commercial airlines. In the case of the Aircraft-Based Observations Program, most of the major commercial airlines in the US take a wind and temperature observation every few seconds on ascent and descent. And we purchase that data and use it in our models and our operations. And the Mesonet program has something called TAMDAR, which is something more than TAMDAR now, but it's similar to that. And it's sort of smaller aircraft and smaller airlines that are serving not major hubs and filling in gaps in the Aircraft-Based Observations Program. So I had here on the left, as I went through this, some information about, the costs and data rights and things like that, and how much we want to pay for data and what the purpose is and that sort of thing. But I wanted to sort of introduce what these two programs were about before I got into that. So what I had said there on the previous slide is that we have a lot of surface data over the United States. So how much would we buy? Well, we're probably reaching the point of diminishing returns, but nevertheless, it fills a lot of gaps in our federal observing capabilities to really help our high resolution weather forecasts beyond what our own federal observations infrastructure could provide. Now for vertical profiles, be it ground-based remote sensing or aircraft typed observations, we're nowhere near reaching the point of diminishing returns with the type of an amount of data that we're buying there to support our operations. Next slide, please. So again, how much data do you buy? It depends on your application. For all the surface data, situational awareness, numerical weather prediction, not so much, but in some cases, yes. So you buy out as much as you can to get those fine scale observations that help you with your real-time warning operations. How much do you buy also, of course, depends on trade-offs between quantity and price. We're all operating inside of fixed budget paradigms in a public-private partnership. The complexity of the infrastructure tends to drive the price. Something like aircraft observations and ground-based remote sensing. As you might imagine, it takes a lot more complexity and expense to gather those observations, and therefore the government would be willing to pay a higher price to fill in gaps in its own capabilities for that purpose. Next slide, please. So who pays? So all of these commercial and let's say in non-federal data, because in some cases it's not necessarily commercial or the private sector, it's things like the states. Well, who pays depends is very much related to the notion of data rights. So it's often assumed that when the federal government buys something, that the taxpayer owns it and that we are required to distribute it freely. That's not quite true. You can buy something called limited data rights. And in the case of the National Mesonet program, most of those data we purchase NOAA-only data rights. That means that we can use it only for our internal purposes, and we didn't buy the right to redistribute it to other users. So what that does is it allows those networks to have other markets to sell their data into. That way, the government is not paying full freight for the operating revenue or cost of operating a network. And those other markets are sharing the cost of that data with the government, hence a public-private partnership. Aircraft-based observations is a bit different in that regard. It is a global program. The United States is one participant. We buy data from our airlines. Other nations and weather services do the same. We share it intergovernmentally in real time for a sort of treaty convention in the World Meteorological Organization. So that's one different approach to cost sharing and cost equity, is different nations buying data and sharing it all with each other in a global pie. Whereas for something like Mesonet, which is mostly domestic data, other countries tend not to be interested in that so much. So there's not a cost sharing mechanism where they're also buying private surface data and sharing it with us. Of course, the third alternative to all of this is that the government buys free and open data rights and shares everything with everyone all the time. But the question is, when does that exceed the cost of operating a federal capability? And then what is the benefit to the taxpayer of having a public-private partnership? Next slide, please. So all of this is, of course, about contracting and how you structure contracts and how you buy data. In the case of National Mesonet, we look at it from the perspective of a unit being a station that provides wind, temperature, moisture, et cetera. And we look at that station and say, we're going to buy the data from that station for 1 year in this case, and that's our price. Now, it varies a bit depending on the type of data. For example, TAMDAR and aircraft-based observations. There's a lot of communications costs associated with that and radioing those data in real time to the ground. And you might buy the data not in terms of looking at an aircraft and I want all the data from it for a year, but every time it takes off and lands and gives us a vertical profile like a weather balloon does, I say, I want that vertical profile, and that's my unit price of data. Next slide, please. This is a bit detailed I'm probably going to go over 8 minutes, but nevertheless, even if I had more time, this would probably be a bit too detailed. But you know, how much you pay is a trade-off between expense versus quality. The highest impact data to your operations in the case of, and from the perspective of the National Weather Service. The lowest value might be sort of free and ubiquitous data that you're paying for a service for someone just simply to aggregate and provide to you, because they're not downstream having the cost of actually operating an observing system themselves. Next slide, please. So I think I've touched a bit on there's the domestic versus international considerations in all of this. From the perspective of the National Weather Service, we can purchase a lot of data and use it domestically in our operations, and certain aspects of those domestic operations are not going to be of interest to our partners in the global community. But there are other types of data that we purchase that are going to be of interest to them, because not only do we run numerical weather prediction over a small domain over the United States, where mostly our own data is involved, but we run a global model. And so we want data from other nations that will feed our global model. They want data from us that will feed their global model. Weather has no borders. So in the end, it's all in the best interest of everyone to share data with each other and find some way to do it in a cost-effective way, if that data is going to have a significant impact on the scale of global numerical weather prediction. Now, how you share these costs, you can break it down regionally. The World Meteorological Organization has 6 regions. Nations in those regions could pool their resources and buy data. That's one way to look at it. The other way is like aircraft-based observations. You buy your data, I buy my data. I don't charge you anything to share it with you, and vice versa. One thing you kind of want to avoid, if at all possible, in the international dimension is intergovernmental transfer of funds. That's very difficult to do, especially on an annual basis. It's just a very difficult bureaucratic process. But also, you want to avoid entering into contracting arrangements where you're at the behest of other governments, because you're sometimes not quite sure whose sovereign law applies to contracting and liability matters. Next slide, please. So just to summarize very briefly, so what should a good public-private partnership be for environmental, Earth observations, meteorological data, et cetera? I think from the perspective of the National Weather Service, obviously, it should provide data at a cost less than it would cost the federal government to build out its own federal observing capability. So you can buy data, or you can pay for the infrastructure and labor to maintain your own observing system. But the trade-off is that, if you can buy the data at a lower price than it would cost you to operate your own capability, and you're filling gaps in your federal capabilities, that's a no-brainer. Your data rights, again, have to be in tandem with how widely you're going to use and share the data, only for your own domestic purposes versus internationally. And of course, that comes with increased price. The wider you share, the more you're going to pay for the data. And in everything you do with all of these different types of data buy programs, one thing you want to do is not necessarily pay for data that you can get elsewhere or data that's free and ubiquitous, but you want to incentivize the private sector and the non-federal sector in such a way as to deploy observing system assets in data void regions around the globe and domestically that are beyond the reach of your federal budget and your federal observing systems. So with that, I think that's all I have, and I apologize if I greatly exceeded my 8 minutes, but it may have been close. So thank you.
Thank you, Curtis, and I apologize for the snafu on the start time. We appreciate your rallying, and we are happy to give you the 8 minutes. So we've got some follow-up questions that we'll have in the panel part, but before we do that, any questions from the crowd, either online or in the room? We're getting the microphone out to them, Curtis.
Hi, thanks, Curtis. This is Ken Casey. I really appreciated your presentation. I work at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, and one of the things that always struck me as really interesting about these commercial data buys was sort of the math that's going into it. Because I work at the long-term archive and repository, so we're all about data reuse. So I think I have two questions. One is, have you guys factored like the potential value of data reuse into the analysis that you do when you're looking at this sort of cost-benefit analysis of, should we buy the data at these rights, or just NOAA only, or is it worth spending more to allow us to redistribute or reuse it later on?
Are you asking me specifically, are we buying sort of archive rights?
Not just no, because I know that a lot goes into that, and when we set up the arrangements, we understand whether the data will be archived or not, or whether it can be redistributed or not. I'm really asking, I think, about the mathematics of your valuation of the data. Like obviously you're factoring in this initial use of it for the specific intent that you're buying it for, but are you factoring in any value for the long-term potential reuses later on down the road?
Well, I would say that in the case of the state measurements in particular, a premium is put on ensuring that we get comprehensive metadata along with that data so that it can be used for future purposes. And the way future research purposes, and the way we define that requirements for those metadata is in such a way that in order to provide those comprehensive fields, your data itself really needs to be sort of climate quality data. It can go into the archive and be used for those future types of purposes beyond just the sort of near real-time, meteorological and weather operations, weather forecasting day to day. So yeah, I guess that is factored in that sense of getting that comprehensive metadata and ensuring climate quality data. And of course, putting those requirements on the contractors comes with an increased price. So yeah, the valuation does figure into it.
Yeah, and I think the follow-on question I had was sort of on that note, like there's an element of what we do ensure in terms of ensuring the public can trust the outcomes, that we, and so if we are not able to reshare the data, then how can anybody validate what we've done independently, or if you think about it in terms of scientific reuse? So I was wondering, so it does sound like you are factoring that into your thinking when you're setting up these commercial data buys as well.
Yeah, and in most cases, the restriction NOAA only on the data is real time. I mean, there are some exceptions because there are some networks which, they turn a profit off archive data, insurance, reinsurance, that sort of thing. But in general, any sort of, the data can be released to the research community for validation of its quality. And that's ongoing for the most part in the scientific literature with many of the state mesonets, independent of the National Mesonet Program and its data restrictions.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks for the great questions. Let me flip it a little bit so Synoptic is the lead subcontractor on the National Mesonet Program. We kind of work with all 51 data partners to determine what the reimbursement rates are and things like that. And so to answer your first question, I think basically our assumption is that the relative value of archive data is pretty much proportional to the relative value of the data for real time. Real time really is the first foremost usage for most of this data in the National Mesonet Program. And so I think basically our assumption is it kind of has the same relative value, one type of data versus another from an archive purpose. So, okay, great question. Dave.
Sorry, this is just a quick follow-up to Ken's question. So is it, because I was lost just a little bit, is the data that you purchase, Curtis, for say a year to go into numerical weather prediction models archived at NCEI over the long term? Or is
Yes, it is. MADIS, the Meteorological Assimilation Data Ingest System, which is sort of our front end, also has a sort of archive that's a little more readily accessible to the public. But over time, it does go into the deep archive at NCEI. That's pretty much I believe that's a policy, if not legal requirement for any kind of NOAA data, observational data.
That's great, thanks. So my question from your presentation, this is Dave Jones with Storm Center Communications. You had mentioned that you purchase the data that's restricted to NOAA only, but it doesn't include any derived products, right? So if you derive products from any of the data purchases that you make, you can freely distribute those and make those part of a National Weather Service product. When you do that, do you have to acknowledge the data that went into the derivation of that product? Or is it just, hey, we used a lot of our observation products, we ran this model or ran this AI or machine learning and came up with these new products? I guess the question is, do you have to acknowledge where the data came from to create that? Thanks.
Not necessarily. The U.S. National Weather Service is unique in that it freely distributes all of its products and services. It doesn't commercialize products and services. So the clause in the contract is essentially any product and service that's already free to the public in which National Mesonet data is used. We reserve the right to freely distribute those products and services. There is no requirement per se to acknowledge any input observational data, whether it's federal or Mesonet or whatever, in products and services. Oftentimes, though, as a attribution matter, you'll see in forecast offices when there's a local storm report or something like that, they'll say Mesonet and some, a severe gust or heavy rainfall or something. Sometimes they will say which specific Mesonet it is. I think that's just practice over the years in the forecast offices and elsewhere, but it's not necessarily a legal or policy matter at the contracting or agency level.
So this is actually more of a panel question, but it's relevant, so I wanted to get it out there. Yeah, so my name is Dave Fishman. I'm an entrepreneur with NOAA. And so my question for you, Curtis, is are you seeing a trend of buying more and more data? And at what point does, if that trend is increasing, if we are buying more and more data, at what point is there an inflection point where maybe NOAA gets out of the satellite business altogether, or and turns it over to the nano satellites that the private sector is doing? And maybe I could almost dare to say, what is the relevancy of NOAA in the future if the private sector can do it cheaper and easier and better, and as accurate, and then is making an economy over it and actually generating money and tax, getting taxed on it? So at what point is that, where is that inflection point where we should really seriously take an inward look and say, maybe we should change our business model?
So if anyone ever wondered what a can of worms looks like, that's it. So a great question. I don't know, Curtis, do you want to try? And we absolutely can get into that for the panel of what's better suited to government only, what's better suited to commercial only, what's better suited to a public-private partnership. Curtis, you want to go?
Not really, but I can't speak for the agency. I'm just running a couple of programs here, and that's a huge policy and political and all sorts of things are encumbered in that question. But I have sought over 13 years now to basically not replace or take away anything that's inside of the federal mission of the National Weather Service, but to complement it in a cost-effective way with capabilities that the states, the private sector, et cetera, can provide us that improve the bottom line of our forecast and warning skill. I never make arguments when I'm asked, take some money from this federal observing system or that, and it should be better invested in Mesonet or other aircraft-based observations. This is about improving and building upon, not competing with, replacing, supplanting, or anything like that.
Okay, Dave.
Curtis, this is Dave Jones. One more question. I was just thinking about, this has really come a long way. I mean, this is terrific to get public or private sector data incorporated. I think 10 years ago it didn't exist, and NOAA was like, we're not buying any data to put in because we can't verify the quality. So congratulations for that. We do a lot of work with NESDIS and the JPSS program, and I'm just wondering, I've asked questions over the years, how much data from satellites goes into numerical weather prediction models? And the answer has always been 99.9% of the observation data that goes into NWP comes from satellites. I don't know if that's still true based on the amount of upswing in data buys that are going on, but I'm just wondering, has the Weather Service, do you do a deep dive into working more with like JPSS or GOES-R series data to make sure that data is leveraged as much as possible? Because the last I heard, there's not a whole lot yet going into numerical weather prediction models from geo orbit. I'm not sure if that's still true or not.
Well, I might let Jeff Rex tackle the satellite specific parts of it. What I do know from a long time ago when I was a real scientist and not a program manager is that it is true that the satellite data are overwhelmingly the amount of data, that's overwhelmingly the majority of the observational data that goes into numerical weather prediction. Now, whether it has the most significant impact on drawing the initial conditions vis-a-vis the background state and 4D VAR and that sort of 3D VAR ensemble, Kalman filter, that sort of thing. It's a different question which type of data has the most impact on model skill. I know for the high resolution rapid refresh model, for example, which is run hourly, balloons are only launched once every 12 hours. There's a polar orbiter every overpass, I don't know how often that is, but the aircraft-based observations are undoubtedly and demonstrably the #1 source of observational data for the baseline skill and skill improvement of that model. And if you go out to global numerical weather prediction, it's the polar orbiters, and then second is radiosondes, and then third is aircraft-based observations. When you do different types of ways of assessing error growth and skill in numerical weather prediction, that's how it breaks down. So these commercial sources of data, especially aircraft data, have a huge impact on numerical weather prediction, running the gamut from high resolution hourly to global every 6 hours.
Okay, and we'll do one more question. Curtis, will you be able to stay around for the panel?
Sure.
Okay, so let's do one more question and then we'll move on and get through. Go ahead.
Mukul Sanwalkar, SSAI. I was wondering your thoughts on if there's a push for data to be moved to cloud, and more so happening now. And from the stakeholders' point of view, they would want to receive this data, but not just regular data, raw data, but more curated data or any custom-based data. So you think do you think NOAA or partners as such would want to go and do that last mile and have the products be available for such external stakeholders, or do you think there would be you think private sector should probably be be involved a little bit more on that aspect? Any thoughts would be appreciated.
I think the answer to your question, well, to answer to both questions is yes. I do think that we should explore moving towards cloud-based capabilities. We run MADIS, which I mentioned previously, in-house as a federal capability. And I do think the private sector should be involved, especially where, right now we are bringing in these non-federal data sets and we use them for our purposes. But we're also sort of serving as a clearinghouse where, there are data providers who are the networks, and there are data users who want the data to use it in their forecast or whatever application. And right now we're in this sort of clearinghouse role where we're not only bringing in this data and using it for internal weather service operations, but other people are coming us who want the data, and we're in this brokering function. So I've been saying for a long time, I believe that we should not be in that business. That should be a private sector function, and a cloud-based capability is an obvious sort of infrastructure architecture to make that happen.
Okay, thanks. Real good question. And again, I think that gets to kind of the panel questions we'll talk about here. So next up, we have Dr. Makoto Sua. Is a senior disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank. He works with a variety of World Bank activities and projects aimed at strengthening weather, climate, and hydrological services in Africa. Prior to the World Bank, he worked for the WMO both in Geneva and in regional office, has taught at the Kigali Institute of Science in Rwanda, and worked for JICA's Office of Climate Change in Tokyo. He's got a PhD in climate science from Princeton and a Master of Environmental Management from Duke University. Go Blue Devils. Okay. Makoto, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. I guess that you'll be sharing the screen from your side. Perhaps that's easier. So yeah, thank you.
Easier for you. Yeah, I made you a co-host,
for me.
but I can share your slides in
okay, thank you very much.
If that's easier.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation. And then as Steve introduced me, that I'm a senior disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank, and then I'm mainly working on these weather, climate, hydrological services. I'll talk a little bit about public-private, engagement that we're working for Africa. But then, of course, that there are two notes. One is that the scale and scope that we are doing with our client countries in Africa is very different from what you are talking in the United States, right? And of course, that there are many very small net services, and then also that the very weak capacity countries. But yet that the public-private engagement is quite relevant for those countries, and I'll explain in my presentation. The second thing is that we use the term the public-private engagement instead of PPE, following the World Meteorological Organization. And we broadly defined, our definition of public-private engagement is quite broad. It could be that any type of interactions between the public-private sectors. It could be the contractual relationship, or it could be public sector opening up data, and basically private sector comes and add value that provide some value-added services to the end users and so forth. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background. The World Bank is perhaps one of the biggest financiers of the weather, climate, hydrological services in developing worlds, along with the Green Climate Fund. And then especially our portfolio has grown quite rapidly in the last 10 years. Compared to the 2010, that right now our portfolio is perhaps at the 4 times bigger. Reached about $1 billion. And then as you see that not surprisingly, that the regions which are most vulnerable to the disaster and the climate risks have the more and more hydromet investments, including the South Asia, East Asia and the Pacific, and then Africa. Next, please. And over the 10 years that we have gained a lot of the experience, and of course there have been some successes, but also that we've been facing a lot of challenges as well. And there are perhaps a few common challenges that we encounter across our projects and the portfolio. One of them is the services. Of course, that one of the objectives, or one of them, perhaps the main objective of the investment is to improve the hydromet, weather, climate, hydrological services, right? But usually that part comes very late in the project implementation, or sometimes that part is not really taken care of, meaning that that the focus of the investment is more infrastructure side, observation system, and etc. And of course, if you cannot really improve the services, you cannot produce the impacts on the society. And of course, from the development institution point of view, and also decision makers' point of view, what we want to see is the impacts, right? That how the investment is translated in the socioeconomic benefits in the society. It's very difficult to prove it, but you have to show it. And that there's a lack of impacts that usually translated into the lack of funding. So even though that all those projects can finance some of the technical assistance, consulting services, CARPEX, and so forth, but because that there is no visible impacts, it's very difficult to convince the Minister of Finance to increase, for example, the operational and the maintenance budget, so that perhaps those who are working in the development, you're very familiar with the sustainable challenges when the projects end up in everything stopped. That is a very common story, and everybody is aware of that. At the same time, that over the next last couple of years, that we see, or perhaps at the longer than that, we see a lot of the changes in that this community, right? We have the more and more private sectors, with a new technology, new ideas, new business models. So that the discussion has started a couple of years ago, how we're going to harness that, changing the landscape in our investment project. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, before COVID, we started, to think that that there is a platform like American Meteorological Society to bring together public and private sectors for the United States, for instance, but for the developing countries context, there is now such a platform to discuss the issues. So we thought that we need to do that, and we've started this Global Weather Enterprise Forum in 2018. So we had this first meeting in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure who are in the room in Pittsburgh. Maybe some of you have attended this meeting. And a little bit later, that the World Meteorological Organization also started this open consultative platform to discuss the opportunities and then challenges in order to promote this public-private engagement. And motivated by this, that we also did some analysis, because what we want to do is that translate that the global level discussion into the project. So we thought that some guidance is needed how we're going to do it in developing countries. So we did some comparative analysis of 6 countries, both the developed and developing countries, and also that review that two countries which went through the policy changes, Germany and Israel, and how the policy changes impacted the way that the private sector is engaged in this sector. So now that I think that for the last 1 or 2 years, really that we've been focusing on how we're going to do it on the ground. I think that we try to bring this discussion to the level closer to the ground, so the sub-regional level and also the national level. And I think that the discussion pretty much mirrors at what we are discussing at the global level. I mean that the trust issue has been always discussed, that it's very important to build a trust between the public and private sectors. In addition to that, I think that in the context of the countries we are working on, we repeatedly find out that the private sector is not aware of well aware of what actually is there in the market, what market offers, and what kind of services are there. Many of them have this very still a traditional view of the market, and that the private sector is basically the supplier of equipment. But of course, that is, I mean, there are of course a lot of the equipment providers, but there are much more than that right now. So I think that that is very important to create that awareness among the public sectors in those countries that what are being offered in the market right now. At the same time, that I think that some of the private sector is showing interest in working in Africa or the other parts of the developing world. I think they said that they need to understand a little bit better about the needs of the countries. But of course, that is a talking, right? And then the other players said that we need to do something, because doing something together will be perhaps the best way to also create or to build a trust between the public and private sectors. So in that context, we are trying to create a space in our investment projects to so that some of the small public-private engagement type of projects or sub-projects can be implemented in the larger investment projects. And this can be anything, and we've just started this conversation, and it'll be interesting to hear from you what kind of things that we can do. But I think that the idea is, let's do something tangible, hands-on things on the ground. So that's the kind of the flow of thinking in the last 4 or 5 years. Next slide, please. Behind that, it's really the change of the strategic thinking, right? In the past, the investment is focusing on the public sector, national met hydrological services, and the assumption here is that the NMHS should do everything from A to Z, and that the focus is that almost always infrastructure. Even though that the project documents talks about the importance of services, but if you see that the review of the investment projects in the past, disproportionate amount of the money actually is invested in infrastructure. But rather, I think that in looking forward, what we need to do is to focus on the entire hydromet value chain contributed by all the partners, including the private sectors and academic sectors. In many countries, maybe the national met hydrological services continue to play an important role. I hear that the very interesting question to the previous speaker about the relevance of the public sector. I think that's a very interesting and important question in the context of the developing countries as well. In Africa, there are 54 countries and there are 54 national met hydrological services. I'm sure it's quite relevant to ask whether we need the 54 national hydrometeorological services, or maybe the roles and responsibility of those met services, do not have to be the same, right? That small met services could have the very different mandate, the way that they operate, for instance. And also that the focus of the investment should be that a little bit more on the data and services going forward, rather than just purchasing the equipment and so forth. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'll just give you the one example. So this is the one project we just started implementing, that's the West Africa Food System Resilience Program. And this has this is a multi-phased regional project involving a number of countries in West Africa. Then that it has the regional level and the national level investments. And one of the very important components of this project is the agromet and the weather climate hydrological services to support the food system resilience. And within that, we embedded this space to, the start of this, public-private engagement, the pilot project, or not, perhaps I wouldn't call it the pilot, but small public-private engagement projects. Next, please. So under this type of project, this is perhaps one of the first that we are trying. We'll try to do this a tangible project, but at the same time that we'd like to create the space to discuss the strategy. What are the strategic issues that each country has to address in order to incorporate the capability and the capacity of private sectors and academic sectors so that the country can develop hydromet value chain in a most effective and efficient manner. And the other is a policy dimension. And I think this is very important, and that our comparative advantage clearly shows that there are a few parameters which really influence the way that the public-private engagement is shaped. One is a mandate of national meteorological services. For example, there are other countries where that the public sector has or is allowed to do the commercial activities. And of course, that has a huge implication on how the private sector operates in that country. The other is a data policy because of the the number of the service side of the private sectors rely on the data from the public sector right now in many countries. So those are perhaps the two parameters that we need to discuss further as we move forward with this public-private engagement discussion in the countries like Africa. Next, please. And I think that's pretty much the end of my presentation. And then I look forward to that further discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Makoto. Due to my poor MC skills, I'm going to hold the questions for the panel later on to make sure we give Kelly enough time, and we have time at the end for the presentation. Unless if there's one question I'll give for Makoto. The usual suspect. Yeah, why don't you hold the microphone there?
I used to play baseball. I could catch this mic. Makoto, thanks for your presentation. This is Dave Jones with Storm Center Communications. I was just wondering, how does the World Bank approach integration of innovation into your projects? For example, here we have the Small Business Innovation Research Program that's funded by the federal government to spur innovation. These are new technologies that have to be invented to address grand challenges that federal agencies might have, something that the World Bank could leverage across other nations. And I'm wondering if you know about that program and how you see integration of innovation into your new approach. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I'm not familiar with the program you mentioned, but of course that this inclusion of integration of innovation is a quite important agenda. The one thing that I have to emphasize is that the World Bank project is basically implemented by the government, right? We finance, and that the government, we lend the money, and the government who borrow the money from us that implement the project. So it is very important at the end of the day, if the government is convinced to do it, with the innovations. And then that is the kind of the challenging part in my, in my experience, that we, always try to bring in that some of the innovative ideas, and that sometimes we make it, we organize a workshop so that the different type of ideas are presented and different options are presented. But at the end of the day, it's the government who chooses what to do with all those different options. And my observation is that there is a tendency that the government tries to be conservative and chooses that all the proven technologies, which means is sometimes not very innovative, perhaps in our context. So how we're going to do it is very challenging things, and then I perhaps would like to ask the other colleagues who are working in public sector side what are the actual kind of what are the buttons that we should push to incentivize the government to integrate those innovations. And then I think that keeps that's the struggle that we are having over the years. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. And let me introduce our last speaker, Kelly Page, the Chief Executive Officer of the Great Lakes Observing System, and has served there since 2015. Prior to that, she was with GLOS from the ground up, basically working with stakeholders, product development, then eventually providing strategic direction, including data management and observing. Prior to GLOS, she worked for the Nature Conservancy, as well as a number of kind of local and regional organizations, various government and NGOs. She has a BA in Public Policy from DePaul and an MS in Resource Ecology and Management from Michigan. So thanks, Kelly.
Bear with me 1 minute here while I don't want to duplicate. I want to extend. Let's see how much Jim just broke. And you are presentation number 5. And we will slideshow. It's got to chew on it for a second. We've got a hefty presentation in front of us, I think. So I know it belongs over there. Can we update? All right, Windows. The X buttons have all disappeared. Let's just try and close it and open it again.
Kelly, are you comfortable going from memory? If not, we can press on
That's
with
fine.
come back.
That's fine. I
wonder if-
didn't know that it was going to break.
Oh,
You're the winner.
You know, I almost put one with the animation, so I would have broken it for you.
all right, and then we will share our screen. Sharing screen 2. Oh man, it's like I know how to use a computer. Slideshow with presenter mode from the beginning. From the beginning. There we go. Hey.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm so short. How am I going to stand and have anyone see me? Okay. Okay. Keeps my notes. Okay. It's all right. I'll just be sitting on my tiptoes. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to present today and talk about our experience with public-private partnerships. A little bit of background on the Great Lakes Observing System. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we provide end-to-end data services to support science, policy, management, and industry in the US and Canada. We are primarily funded through a cooperative agreement with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the IUS program, Integrated Ocean Observing System. And essentially we help fill data gaps, leverage and extend the existing network of observing assets, and support data sharing and integration solutions that make it easier for people to find and access the information that they need about the Great Lakes. I wanna acknowledge my colleague with the Southeast Regional Association, our SACORA, Deborah Hernandez, who helped sort of characterize how we work. We collaborate as partners, and I don't know that we've actually established a definition of partnership, but I think one of the elements of partnership is being able to trust your partner to do something that maybe you're not going to do. And you know, being willing to stay in your lane and having a common understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are in a partnership. We're also flexible in our operations and approach. For me, this means that we're self-aware enough to acknowledge that we don't have the capacity to serve everyone, but we commit to adding value where we can. And that means meeting our partners and our stakeholders where they are in terms of data sharing and also consuming data and information. And finally, we deliver through a service equity lens. You know, ultimately the work that we're doing as a nonprofit organization is to serve the public interest and the best interests of the Great Lakes. And so there's really no inherent stakeholder. You know, recreational boaters aren't inherently more important than you know, drinking water utilities or indigenous communities or government scientists. So when it comes to partnership, the more the better, because you're adding more perspectives and coming to hopefully more effective and impactful solutions. Public-private sector interests are pretty interconnected in the Great Lakes. I think the Midwest has a good reputation, as being a center of manufacturing and trade. Obviously, the economy, depends directly on the Great Lakes in terms of recreational activity, fisheries, et cetera, but it's also the major source of drinking water for over 48 million people who live in these major manufacturing cities like Chicago, Toronto, Cleveland. So from that perspective, healthy, clean and safe Great Lakes is of interest to both the public and private sector in a lot of different ways. And at GLOS, we work with the private sector. They're represented on our board and are engaged in high-level strategic planning. We obviously have multiple relationships with private sector companies as vendors for specific technical tasks, and we work with a variety of different partners and stakeholders in developing and designing projects. I want to talk a little bit, though, about an effort that we worked on called the Smart Great Lakes Initiative. So obviously, as part of the mission of our organization, we've been helping people like scientists and recreational boaters and water utilities access data about the lakes for over 13 years. And we've noticed some interesting trends over time. First of all, we have so much more access to data, diverse types of data, larger data sets, and as a result, we've seen a greater demand for more complex data analysis. We've also seen a change in the way people interact with and consume data through smartphones and on-demand applications. Individuals are no longer satisfied visiting a website or a data portal every day to learn about the conditions on the lake. They prefer to receive alerts or push notifications or explore an app on their mobile device. And if you think about it, really, these trends are just indicative of the way that smart technologies have transformed the way our society and the world interacts. Smartphones, inexpensive sensors, you had me at the size of a wine box, are proliferating and really influencing how we choose to search for, consume, and share information. And we've talked a lot already about technology advancements like distributed sensing, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. These are tools and technologies and solutions that are being used in so many other areas of our life, but I'm not really sure that we've realized the full potential of these innovations in natural resource management. And for those of us in the Midwest, spoiler, for those of us in the Midwest, we are hearing a lot of buzz about how we are going to be a climate refuge and that people from Florida and Texas and California are going to be moving to the Midwest. And it really begs the question, is our infrastructure ready? Are our natural resources ready for this great migration? And the answer is no. There's a lot of gaps in data and information that we have in the region. And so this is really what inspired the vision behind Smart Great Lakes. And so in 2019, we released an update to our strategic plan and started the work of inviting partners to join us in this effort to realize a vision for Smart Great Lakes. And so two of our early partners, the Council of the Great Lakes Region, which works on promoting economic development in the Great Lakes, and Cleveland Water Alliance, which is a technology innovation hub based in Cleveland, obviously, were some of our early supporters, and we quickly grew that partnership to multiple organizations, government agencies, academic institutions in the US and Canada, who are all obviously invested in this idea of how we can achieve Smart Great Lakes. we thought we started this in the middle of the pandemic, or at the beginning of the pandemic essentially, and had these grand visions of having everyone come to workshops and conversations and meetings like this. And of course that didn't happen. We had to do it all over Zoom. And we wanted to develop a common strategy document that would serve as sort of a guiding resource for all the partners involved. And my staff and I thought, oh geez, like no one's gonna wanna write a document from scratch, you know, working off the side of their desks in the middle of a pandemic. We probably should just write this document ourselves and just let everyone, you know, check mark it. And to our surprise, all of the partners were really engaged and invested in developing this common strategy together. And so it was really a grassroots effort that, you know, got input from everybody involved. And so I'm really proud of that. Ultimately, the common strategy that we developed was a call to action, obviously for more investment, who doesn't want more money, but also for improved coordination and collaboration across these different sectors, and most importantly, inclusive for all stakeholders. One of the early things that we identified as a gap in our approach was the fact that there was no engagement from Indigenous communities or participation. So we're actually working on exploring an Indigenous-led Smart Great Lakes initiative to see if this idea resonates with Indigenous communities and how they would want to develop a similar collaborative effort centered on their priorities. And we also identified a couple of other major gaps in the Great Lakes, one being the lack of winter monitoring or observations, and also some very outdated bathymetric maps. And so the group is working on taking some first steps towards addressing those gaps as well. And then internally at GLOS, like I mentioned, we work with a lot of different software companies, equipment manufacturers, consultants, et cetera, a lot of different private sector organizations in terms of collecting the data, managing the data, distributing the data, and the development of our data sharing platform, which we call Seagull. And Seagull, you know, so much of what we did with Smart Great Lakes really influenced our approach to the design of Seagull. It's user-centered design, cloud-based. We're working with software companies with an expertise in IoT because we want this to be able to grow and expand as new types of data and new sources of data come online. But I would say in terms of my experience, you know, for public-private partnerships, I really think successful partnerships depend on individuals who have a cooperative attitude and that all the partners have a common understanding of the goals and expectations. Ultimately, you know, I like to think of what we do at GLOS and what I think a lot of the programs that I've heard about today at the conference, I like to think of them more as public interest technology. And this is sort of a newer discipline or field of study that talks about the application of technology expertise to advance the public interest and generate public benefits, promote the public good. And I think that, you know, it's obviously important to recognize that you know, it's a good relationship dynamic to be able to, for lack of a better phrase, outsource some of our tasks, needs, technology solutions to the private sector, but that doesn't absolve you know, the public sector of having the appropriate oversight and expertise to make sure that the outcomes of these projects are really serving the public good. And then finally, you know, at the end of the day, why do we have this data, or why are we collecting this data? Why are we sharing this data? In theory, it's to solve some problems, right? Or to inform us about the management and policy that we're doing. And I think that effective problem solving requires, you know, thoughtful framing of the problem. acknowledging that the technology and the data are tools to help us arrive to those solutions, but they are not in and of themselves the solutions, and centering our stakeholder interests as we design, the ways that we're going to approach and solve these problems. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Kelly, thanks. I think that last set of slides kind of teased things up pretty well, but first off, any questions for Kelly specifically? Otherwise, we'll kind of get into the group discussion. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I think we can jump into some worthwhile discussions real quick. So any questions for Kelly specifically? Sure.
Great presentation, Kelly.
Thank you.
On the topic of citizen science or participatory mapping, so it looks like a lot of data is coming ground up, right, in your case. So some of the issues that people have faced in the past are how do you maintain this data, whose data, or who has ownership to the data, and what has it been used for? Who is kind of the holder of that resource? So have you encountered any issues, and if so, how were you able to solve or resolve those?
Sure. Well, I think every data provider type that we work with has issues or concerns in terms of wanting to have a say over the terms of how their data is shared. And so it's really not unique to community science or citizen science. It's, academic institutions, fishery managers, whoever the data provider is obviously concerned about how their data is being used. I know that for, like for instance, National Weather Service purposes, you need to have data meet a certain standard and a certain protocol in order to be able to use it to make a weather forecast that's used by the public. But truthfully, the way that people are getting information about how they make decisions, in their daily lives is not necessarily always coming from a certified federal government source, right? Like we're looking at social media, we're looking at, other crowdsourced points of information. I think it's important to find that balance or find where the confluence is between the, official certified validated data and information and the community generated information, the crowdsourced information, to meet people where they're at in terms of how they're consuming information. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how valid or certified or QA/QC'd your data is. Like if people aren't using it, then what's the point? So I don't have a specific, example of how we've had to overcome that necessarily, but just to say that in our data portal, we do have a separate area for community science, citizen science, just to make that distinction for people when they're visiting the website so they understand, the source of information, like very obviously and distinctly up front. But I think it's a challenge that as, professionals in this field, we have to be prepared to find where those points of compromise are so that people are actually using the data or using the information, I should say.
That's great, thanks. I think that's we deal with that problem a lot in the National Measurement Program and in other programs, and I think the right answer is as long as the user is making an informed decision, has an awareness of the strengths and limitations of the data, then everything's okay. It's when, if by any chance data is being passed off as being more authoritative than it really merits, that's when problems come. So I think as long as, again, transparency and kind of honesty about where the data is coming from is a big step towards that solution. So we don't have a lot of time, but really what I'd like to kind of come back to the topic it brought up, again, your name, Dave. We obviously can't get into the whole discussion, but I think one thing that really intrigues me is, public-private partnerships are not the solution for everything. But here's my question for this group, and I'm going to start with Jeff because he's been sitting there lazy for an hour. What kind of efforts are well suited to a public-private partnership, and what kind of efforts are not? Are there some that should be all private sector, some that should be all government, or which ones are well suited to a mix?
Boy, it's a loaded, as Curtis said earlier, it's a loaded topic and a loaded question. From the past, I guess 6 or 7 years, because we talked about the history and the validation. So there's the commercial weather data pilot in 2016, 2017, maybe even into early 2018. That's where everything was validated, kind of prototype. Is the data good? Is it useful? To the commercial weather data purchase process, which started in late 2017, early 2018, and has involved a lot of the different sources we've talked about here. Everything Curtis talked about, the data I talked about, different developments, the Mesonet programs, all these different pieces kind of come together. But there's been a ramp for sure. The first, I said we were in data order 4 right now. First data order had, I think it was 500 or 1,000 vertical profiles a day. Right now, data order 4 has 6,000, 5,500 from us and 500 from another supplier, 6,000 vertical profiles a day. Next year, there'll be a new IDIQ that will probably ramp that up to a slightly larger number and might invite other people as well. I think there are certain things that where we're providing, where the private industry is providing efficiencies and quantities of data that make it a lot more cost effective and efficient, because like, let's take our satellites, for instance, they're multi-purpose satellites. So like I said, in the, kind of when I was describing the company, they track aircraft, they track ships, they do radio occultation data, they do reflectometry data. Well, NOAA's primary interest is the radio occultation data, but there's an economy of scale in launching a constellation of satellites or a network of satellites that do multiple things, including that, rather than just launching dedicated radio occultation satellites. So there's an economy of scale coming in here. It's the same thing once you reach a critical mass with a lot of different sensor technologies. On the flip side, a lot of the data assimilation and computing, the HPC, and a lot of the other technologies that the Weather Service is using to assimilate data, run models, and meet the mandate of their charter to the public and to the taxpayers, those are mammoth expenses. I think we're a long way from that ever becoming private, because it's something for the public good, paid for by the public, and it returns to the public. Even in what we do, we kind of go back and forth with NOAA in a symbiotic relationship. What I talked about is the data buys, but in reality, we work with NCAR, we work with NOAA on different NCEP, on different capabilities to run our own models with our data, with some of their data, and then we're also selling them data. So there's a symbiotic relationship as you go forward. Our focus is like customer specific. NOAA's focus is global, returning their information the best possible forecast out to the taxpayer. So I think there's a symbiosis that goes on and will continue to go on for at least in my mind, the foreseeable future, for a long time. But Curtis may have additional thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, Curtis, you want to take a cut at that from your perspective on the public side?
Yeah, well, it's something Jeff said I keyed in on. The global data assimilation will for some time to come be the purview of governments. Beyond that, though, tailored services, smaller scale numerical weather prediction, precisely the kinds of numerical weather prediction that need the observations that are provided by things like the National Mesonet and aircraft-based observations. My personal opinion is that there is room for that, for the private sector to step up there. The Weather Service doesn't normally do what we call specialized services. So for example, if there's an event, NASCAR, or something like that, and generally the Weather Service would avoid providing free services and forecasts, something like that, and let the private sector have that business. And it's precisely the kinds of observations and observing systems that we don't operate that those private sector businesses can use to provide those tailored products and services. I'm touching on something here that's not really about observations, and I'm probably going to get myself in trouble. I think that the core of the Weather Service's mission will always have to extend to the protection of life. So that is, we cannot move toward a world where we are privatizing tornado warnings, flash flood warnings, even though there are observations out there in the private sector and numerical weather prediction capabilities that could improve perhaps the skill or, probability of detection of those types of events. You open up some really hard issues when you talk about there's someone in the public or in the corporate or whatever sector, are they entitled to a warning because they can pay for it when the protection of life is at stake? So I think that will always be a bit of a red line where there's one thing that government should do, that's probably it.
Right. I think that's a really important, and you look at the weather value chain. I think the boundaries at different parts of that value chain are what are shifting. What used to only be able to be done by government now can be done in some cases, as you said, like specific technical areas and things like that. And I want to just throw it back to Dave, who asked the question earlier, and kind of see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so by no means, since I do work for NOAA, I'm trying to talk myself out of a job, because that would be absolutely crazy, at least until I retire. But with that said, my point being, what I really want to emphasize, and what I've got Jeff. What I think what I want to point out is, and what you just described to me in my head sounds like that your role is not linear, meaning the service that you provide is actually accelerating. It's actually I think you're providing a role that's gaining ground every year. So I think your role is not linear. I think it's kind of on it's on an accelerating slope. And my point being is, and this is why I asked, what's that inflection point? At what point should we, being NOAA or the government in general, think about how much more can we rely on the private sector, and at what point should we change our business model so that it better reflects and better works with the private sector? Because to change the government business model, that's like an act of Congress. That's like a 10-year thing. And if we don't think about it now, when we do look at that inflection point, we're going to say it's already passed. Now we're in crisis mode. Now we can't support them, or we're unable to support them. We're unable to do the crowdsourcing because we don't have the guidance or the policy. And now we're playing catch up. And while we're playing catch up, the private sector is just continuing to accelerate. And they're just going to blow us away. So if we don't start looking at that now, while we have time to look at it, then we won't become obsolete. Does that make sense? Oh, by the way, and if you really want a really good explanation, my talk's on Thursday where I talk about this. But yeah. That's the point that I'm trying to get out from your observations, from the private sector's point of view. How can we stay relevant?
Okay.
You don't think we've passed that point yet? Target can send you coupons for boxed wine and Cheez-It crackers. I know, because they send them to me all the time, based on your shopping history and other things that they know about you. Why can't we do that for the environment? I think the private sector has already passed us. So we are playing catch up now.
And so we're obviously over. I'm very happy to continue this conversation, I think. And what I'll say is, let's take Dave's question, and then for those of us who are here in Pittsburgh, let's please continue this conversation. It sounds like Dave's got a great talk. And one other, in particular for ESIP, from what I understand, there has been a public-private partnership cluster that has kind of atrophied a little bit. So if you're interested in continuing to address these questions, please reach out to us. I think there's a lot of value to it. So, Dave.
Thanks, and sorry to take us over. I just wanted to, with Curtis, I guess, still on the line, I was just wondering, I've been around NOAA for a long time. I don't work for NOAA, but have partnered with them. And, you know, for many, many years, we always hear, oh, budget, our budget's constrained, we can't do this, our budget. But then we see these data buys ramping up, and, you know, they're buying, you know, more and more data, which is great, from the private sector. I think there needs to be much more private sector involvement in NOAA. Yet when there is innovative technology out there that can help the National Weather Service do things more efficiently, they're like, oh, we can maybe develop that ourselves and not move forward with innovation to integrate into their operations. And so I'm just wondering, you know, as part of the observations portfolio, Curtis, how much of the data buy is a part of your budget? You know, how is that ramped up? And where's the room for innovation and, you know, licensing of technologies that can really help the Weather Service address their mission directly?
Well, when I was recruited into the job in 2009, the Mesonet budget was around $8 or $9 million. It's now, as of fiscal year 2022, I think it was 22.7 million. So that's about 10% of the observations, ORF budget, operations, research, and facilities. So kind of the O&M of observing systems. So Mesonet's around 10%, and the other data buys, like aircraft-based, they're a few percent more, maybe 1% or 2%. So it's a significant part of the budget, and it's continued to, you know, consume an increasing part of the observations budget. Historically, the way the National Mesonet program has functioned is public-private partnership is buying data from existing networks, and capital from other sources were used to build those networks. And every state network has most of them have a very interesting and unique story of how they cobble together funding from other agencies or the corporate world or their state legislatures to build their networks. There is legislation afoot right now on Capitol Hill that would greatly expand the scope of the National Mesonet program. An authorization bill essentially authorizing the National Mesonet program, which until now has been appropriated but never authorized. And the legislation spells out rules of the program and all sorts of things. And one of the things it would do is provide funding in the form of grants to build out new networks or to increase capacity in existing networks. So we'll have to feel our way through what that looks like in terms of licensing technologies and the interplay of that with the private sector, and how that all comes to bear, and perhaps changing scope until what until now has been a data buy from existing networks. So we'll see how it plays out.
One more question at the back, I guess.
Just so much of a question and a comment, or to follow up as well. I don't think you're ever going to see government go away, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Right, so the military had GPS technology classified until Desert Storm. Afterwards, they released it, and through commercialization, we all take it for granted that we pay for it. Right. Same thing with the space shuttle program. I'm a contractor, I don't represent NASA, but I can tell you this much. It's not so much as letting the private sector do it, because I'll ask you a question. If I come to you and as a regular private person, I say, I want to have your data, is it free? Right. So
well, it's up to the data owner, yeah.
That would be the one challenge. Okay, if NOAA went away, that data would have to be free because somebody's paying for it, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. You mean the forecast output data?
Well, I'm just saying data in general, because the government agencies in the US by law provide data for free.
Correct.
Okay, so that's one thing to think about, that you can't have a total 100% commercial enterprise running it. Because if that's the case, how come our army doesn't go away? We just hire mercenaries, right? So it's something to think about. The government will always be around, but I see where we're doing the things that we're doing that are good are to fill in the gaps. Because, for example, NASA has the small sat program because it helps fill in the gaps. It's at a cost that NASA is not going to pay for, right? But a commercial enterprise can, and they can have this public-private partnership to fill in those gaps and get the data that's very, very usable to the researchers of the world. And so that's the same thing I see for what you're doing with the Great Lakes, is you're filling in the gaps that other agencies don't have the data for, if that makes sense. So I don't think your job's in jeopardy. If anything, just like GPS, just like space flight in the future, NASA, for example, will focus on flying to Mars, and other SpaceXs of the world will commercialize space hops into the atmosphere. So hopefully that makes sense.
I think that's exactly right. Like some things that government could only do in the 1950s, now companies can do, and on we go. So, Dave's racing for the microphone again.
Final thought, I would love to see the day in a public-private partnership where we in the private sector can go into an office at NOAA or into an office at NASA, and they can look at us and say, how can we help you succeed? How can we help you grow as fast as possible so you can hire as many people as possible so you can stimulate the economy? It feels many times when you go into a federal office, you're a pain, number one. Number two, they don't have the budget. And number three, they're going to listen to you until you walk out the door and nothing's going to happen. So I hope that a successful public-private partnership turns into how can we help you succeed, you know, and that's the way it should look like in the future, I think.
Absolutely. But I give NOAA credit, as we talked about in a couple of cases, ABO, National Mesonet, the data pilot, you know, the space data pilot. There's a lot of cultural, you know, institutional knowledge and stuff that just taken some time to get through with Curtis and others leading the way on that. So again, I think let's stick a pin in it. Again, anyone who is here in Pittsburgh, please, let's go grab a beer and say what we really think. I want to thank all our speakers and thank all of our attendees. A great session today. Thanks.